Era Taishō, the last katana duel, the world between worlds. It was the autumn of 1912, and Japan was suspended between two universes that should not coexist. In the streets of Tokyo, where once only horses' hooves echoed on the dirt, now roared the first automobiles imported from Europe, their metallic horns desecrating the ancestral silence that had defined the capital for centuries. Red brick factories sprouted like poisonous mushrooms between ancient temples, their chimneys belching black smoke that stained skies that had witnessed 1,000 years of contemplative poetry. In this world of brutal contradictions, where men wore English tuxedos over samurai spirits, where geishas learned to waltz in salons that had once held tea ceremonies, lived Watanabe Nobuyoshi, a ghost of an era that had officially died 44 years earlier, but which stubbornly refused to accept its own extinction. Watanabe was what historians would later call an anachronistic samurai, a man born into a family that had served the Tokugawa for 12 generations, educated from childhood in the codes of honor that had governed Japan for 700 years, but forced to live in an age that considered such codes not only irrelevant, but dangerously subversive of the modern order. At 53, he carried his ancestral katana, a blade forged by kotetsu in the 17th century, not as a decorative symbol of the new modernized aristocracy, but as a living extension of his soul, ready to taste blood if honor demanded it. He was the director of a traditional kendo school in Asakusa, where he desperately tried to preserve techniques developed on real battlefields, teaching them to young men living in a world where physical violence had been replaced by economic competition and international diplomacy. But on this particular day, October 15, 1912, Watanabe wasn't thinking about cultural preservation or melancholy nostalgia. He was consumed by a fury that grew in his chest like a fire fueled by centuries of violated tradition, because he had received a letter that challenged not only his personal honor, but the very essence of everything he believed in. The insult letter. The letter had arrived one morning just as the maple leaves were beginning to display shades of red, reminiscent of dried blood. A coincidence Watanabe interpreted as an omen from the gods. The paper was Western, thick and expensive, with crests that spoke of new and ostentatious wealth. The calligraphy was too precise, calculatedly formal, devoid of the soul that should flow through a brush wielded by hands that understood the art of writing as an extension of the art of living. The sender was Sakamoto Jiro, a man who had abandoned his traditional family name to embrace the modern identity of an international businessman. By the age of 41, Sakamoto had built a fortune importing German industrial technology, using political connections he had cultivated through strategic marriages and discreet bribes that characterized the new capitalist establishment. Watanabe-san, the letter read, using honorifics that sounded like insults from such a source, I have heard of your school of ancient techniques and your reputation as a master of obsolete weapons. As a businessman who appreciates historical curiosities, I would like to propose a demonstration that would be mutually beneficial. The next words were written with the calculated cruelty of someone who had learned to destroy men through psychological humiliation rather than physical violence. My youngest son, recently graduated from the Imperial Military Academy, has shown an academic interest in the ancient martial arts. He has modern training in European fencing and firearms. It would be educational to organize a competition that would demonstrate the natural evolution of combat techniques. The real proposal was hidden in the following lines, wrapped in polite language that barely disguised its venom. A public duel between traditional techniques and modern methods, with selected spectators, that would include Western journalists, progressive military officers, and members of the new business elite. Sakamoto's son would fight with a European saber and a modern pistol. Watanabe would be invited to demonstrate katana techniques. Of course, the letter concluded, we understand that ancient methods have practical limitations in the contemporary world. This demonstration would only serve to preserve historical interest in the traditions our ancestors valued before they discovered more efficient approaches to the same goals. It was a challenge disguised as a cultural invitation. It was a public execution disguised as an educational demonstration. It was the symbolic murder of 700 years of Japanese martial tradition, orchestrated by men who had sold their souls for access to international markets and Western approval. Watanabe read the letter 3 times, each reading fueling the fury that was building in his chest like a volcano awakening from a centuries-old slumber. It wasn't just that they were challenging his personal abilities, they were attacking the very essence of everything that had defined Japanese identity for millennia. They were suggesting that Bushidō was a museum curiosity, that Katana was a decorative toy, that the warrior soul that had created Japan was inferior to the mechanical imports of industrial Europe. It was, in every possible sense, a declaration of war against the very concept of traditional honor. The last disciple. The decision to accept the challenge came not from impulse or wounded pride, but from a crystal clarity that Watanabe recognized as Satori, the moment of enlightenment that Zen monks described as a sudden transcendence of worldly illusions. He understood instantly that this would not be just a duel between 2 men, but the final act of a historic tragedy that had begun with the arrival of Commodore Perry's black ships 59 years earlier. He would be the last true samurai to wield a katana in actual combat. Not in demonstration, not in sporting competition, not in nostalgic ceremony, but in mortal combat where honor would be defended through blood spilled for sacred purpose. It was a responsibility that transcended personal life and touched the realm of the ancestors who watched from the spirit world. In the days following the letter's arrival, Watanabe prepared with the meticulousness of someone organizing their own funeral ceremony. He visited his ancestors' graves, paying homage to the 12 swordmasters who had served the Tokugawa and passed down secret techniques through generations who believed such techniques would endure forever. He fasted for 3 days, purifying body and spirit through disciplines that samurai had practiced before battle since time immemorial. But his most important preparation was summoning Tanaka Keisuke, his only true disciple, a young man of 23 who had devoted the last 6 years of his life to learning not just physical techniques, but the spiritual philosophy that transformed steel manipulation into a transcendent art. Keisuke was an anomaly in his generation, the son of a prosperous merchant family who had rejected lucrative opportunities in the new capitalist world to devote himself to the study of traditions everyone considered dead. Tall and thin, with hands calloused from years of wielding wood and steel, he possessed that quiet intensity that characterized men who had found genuine purpose in an age of moral confusion. "Keisuke-kun," Watanabe said the night before the duel, as master and disciple knelt together in the silent dojo where shadows danced between ancient swords. "Tomorrow will likely witness my death, but it will also witness the birth of something new, proof that Bushidō did not die with the Meiji Restoration, that there are still men willing to die for principles that transcend expediency." The young disciple felt tears burning in his eyes, but his voice remained firm. "Sensei, there is another option. This duel is a trap. Everyone knows that modern pistols surpass swords in range and speed. Why don't you refuse? Why don't you preserve your techniques to teach future generations?" Watanabe smiled with a serenity reminiscent of Buddha statues, contemplating the transitory nature of all things. "Because, my young friend, there are moments in history when preservation becomes less important than demonstration. Tomorrow I will not fight to win. I will fight to prove that there are values worth dying for, and that proof will be more valuable than all the techniques I could teach." He paused, contemplating the katana that had been passed down through his bloodline for 200 years. "Besides," he added with a smile that held secrets, "you assume I already know I'm going to lose." The theater of death. The chosen venue for the duel was the garden of the Sakamoto residence, a space that perfectly encapsulated the cultural schizophrenia of the Taishō era. It was a traditional Japanese garden, carefully placed stones, a pond with ancient koi fish, curved wooden bridges over streams that whispered ancient mantras, but surrounded by architecture that screamed aggressive modernity, red brick walls, English glass windows, and a wrought iron greenhouse housing European plants never destined to touch Japanese soil. The spectators arrived as an audience for an execution disguised as cultural entertainment. Western journalists with notebooks ready to document the curious persistence of primitive traditions. Military officers in uniforms that blended German elements with Japanese touches, eager to witness the superiority of modern training. Businessmen in London suits, still bowing with a precision that betrayed samurai training in their youth. Sakamoto Jiro circulated among the guests like the host of a macabre banquet. His words distilled with a condescension he believed to be international sophistication. "You will witness today," he told a London Times correspondent, "how our country has evolved from primitive methods to truly civilized approaches to conflict. It is a demonstration of the natural progress of humanity." His son, Sakamoto Ichiro, was the perfect product of this new philosophy. 25 years old, educated in military academies that emphasized efficiency over honor, he was trained in European fencing that treated combat as a technical problem to be solved through speed and mathematical precision. He wore a modern military uniform, dark blue with gold buttons, a Prussian saber at his side, a Nambu Type A pistol in a sheath that shone like a mirror. When Watanabe entered the garden, the contrast was so stark that some onlookers gasped involuntarily. The old samurai had chosen clothing that made no concessions to modernity: a black hakama, a pristine white kimono, white tabi that allowed silent movement, and a katana whose simple scabbard spoke of quality that transcended ostentation. He moved through the garden like a ghost from a murdered era, each step echoing with a dignity that made modern men feel small and empty. He didn't look at the spectators. They were irrelevant to the ritual he was about to perform. His eyes were fixed on Ichiro, measuring not just his physical capabilities, but his spiritual character. "Watanabe-san," Sakamoto Sr. said, with a bow that managed to be simultaneously correct and insulting, "what an honor to have a master of ancient traditions demonstrate his art to such distinguished observers. My son is eager to learn from your experience." The old samurai did not respond immediately. Instead, he assumed a formal stance of greeting, a deep bow that acknowledged not the man before him, but the ancestors watching from the unseen world. When he finally spoke, his voice carried an authority that silenced even Western skeptics. "Today, I will not demonstrate ancient techniques," he said, each word chosen with the precision of a blade slicing silk. "Today I will prove that Bushidō is not an obsolete method of combat, but a transcendent approach to existence that allows men to overcome limitations others consider absolute." Ichiro laughed, a nervous sound that betrayed more insecurity than intended. "With all due respect, Watanabe-san, modern training is based on scientific principles. Emotionalism can't overcome ballistics." "We'll see," the samurai replied, his hand naturally finding the hilt of his katana. "We'll see if science can kill ghosts." The last cut. The duel began with a formality that none of the spectators fully understood. Watanabe positioned himself exactly 20 paces from Ichiro, a distance that had been calculated by ancient masters as optimal for demonstrating both defensive technique and attacking speed. It was far enough to allow a pistol to be drawn and fired, yet close enough that a katana in the right hands could reach its target before the shot was fatal. Ichiro, confident in his technological superiority, adopted a relaxed posture that spoke of years of military training where victory was calculated through superior equipment. His right hand hovered near his pistol, while his left rested on the hilt of his saber. Preparation for a fight he believed was decided before it even began. "Whenever you're ready," Sakamoto Sr. announced, his voice carrying barely concealed excitement. "You can begin." What followed lasted perhaps 5 seconds of chronological time, but expanded into an eternity where every fraction of movement became verse in an epic written in blood and steel. Ichiro moved first, his hand flying to the pistol with a speed that impressed even seasoned military observers. Modern training had made his body an efficient machine, every muscle coordinated to maximize speed and accuracy. The Nambu Type A left its holster in a fluid motion that spoke of hundreds of hours of repetitive practice, but Watanabe had anticipated this move before it even began. During 40 years of martial arts study, he had learned to read intentions in his opponent's eyes, to perceive the exact moment when mental decision turned into physical action. And, most importantly, he had spent decades perfecting iaijutsu, the art of drawing and cutting in a single motion that connected spirit, steel, and target in an unbroken line of lethal purpose. Watanabe's katana left its sheath like lightning leaves a cloud, not just quick, but inevitable, carrying momentum that had accumulated through generations of masters who had passed down secrets of transcending physical limitations through absolute spiritual focus. The pistol shot echoed through the garden like thunder desecrating a silent temple. The bullet, a metal projectile shaped by German science and Japanese precision, cut through the air exactly where Watanabe would have been if he were an ordinary man obeying ordinary laws of motion and inertia. But the samurai had moved not just through space but through time, anticipating the bullet's trajectory, positioning himself where it would not be, temporarily transforming himself into something that existed between the moments other men inhabited. The blade found Ichiro the instant after the shot, slicing diagonally from his left shoulder to his right hip, a cut masters called kesa-giri, the cut that separates soul from body with an elegance that transcends mere violence. The young officer fell without fully understanding what had happened. His scientific training had not included variables for opponents who could operate according to spiritual laws that contradicted Newtonian physics. He died trying to reconcile mathematical impossibility with the evidence of his own senses. Watanabe remained in the final position of his cut for perhaps 3 seconds, long enough for blood to drip from his blade onto sakura petals that had fallen prematurely, as if the cherry blossoms themselves had wept for the death of an era. Then, slowly, with movements that spoke of ritual more than combat, he cleaned his katana and returned it to its sheath. The sound of steel meeting wood echoed through the silent garden like a bell, marking the end of a sacred ceremony. Bushidō, he said, addressing the transfixed spectators, is not an obsolete technique. It is an approach to existence that allows one to transcend limitations that others consider absolute. My young opponent fought with superior equipment. I fought with a superior soul. He bowed formally to Ichiro's body, not in celebration, but in recognition of the courage demonstrated by someone willing to face death for principles he believed in, even if those principles were false. And now, he added, his words carrying a finality that made some onlookers flinch instinctively, you have witnessed the last true duel this land will ever see. After today, Bushidō will exist only in books and theatrical displays. But for a moment, for this moment, it was real again. The ghost walks. The silence that followed the duel was broken, not by screams or exclamations, but by the sound of someone vomiting violently. One of the Western journalists, who had come hoping to document an amusing cultural curiosity, discovered that witnessing actual death was a fundamentally different experience than reading about it in military reports. Sakamoto Jiro stood over his son's body like a broken statue, his mind struggling to process a reality that contradicted everything he had based his new identity on. His son, educated in the finest military academies, trained with the most advanced equipment available, representing Japan's inevitable future, had been killed by a ghost armed with a relic from a bygone era. Impossible, he murmured, his words directed not at any specific person, but at the universe that had revealed itself to be far more complex than his theories of linear progress. This is impossible. Science overcomes superstition. Modernity overcomes tradition. This cannot have happened. Watanabe approached the broken man with something that might have been compassion, if compassion could coexist with the coldness necessary to carry out what he had just done. "Sakamoto-san," he said, his voice carrying an authority that made powerful men feel like lost children. "You made the mistake of confusing technology with wisdom, equipment with character, material progress with spiritual evolution." He paused, contemplating the garden where tradition and modernity coexisted in a harmony that only death had managed to arbitrate. "Your son died courageously, fighting for the principles he believed in. That honors him, even if his principles were inadequate. But you created this situation to entertain spectators with the humiliation of what you considered obsolete. That does not honor you. The surviving spectators began to slowly disperse, like mourners leaving a funeral that had revealed truths they would rather not have known. Some carried notebooks filled with notes that would never be published because no Western publisher would believe that a man with a sword had defeated a man with a pistol in fair combat. Others simply carried memories that would haunt their dreams for decades to come. But before he left, Watanabe did something no one expected. He approached each spectator individually, bowing formally as if they were worthy of respect they clearly had not earned. "You came here expecting to witness Bushidō's funeral," he told the group. "Instead, you witnessed his temporary resurrection. Remember what you saw here when you're trying to understand why Japanese people sometimes do things that Western logic finds incomprehensible." He walked away from the garden with the serene dignity of someone who had fulfilled his personal destiny and could finally rest. But those who watched him leave noticed something strange. He seemed to be gradually fading, as if the effort to materialize Bushidō in a world that no longer had a place for him had consumed spiritual substance that could not be renewed. That night, Watanabe Nobuyoshi disappeared from Tokyo. Some said he had retreated to a mountain monastery. Others suggested he had committed ritual seppuku in a private ceremony. But Tanaka Keisuke, his only disciple, knew the truth. His master had simply ceased to exist in the modern world, having fulfilled his ultimate purpose of proving that certain truths transcend time and circumstance. The last Katana duel had ended, and with it, not only a young officer died, but also the possibility that tradition and modernity could coexist peacefully in the new Japan. The future would belong to the machines, but for this moment, it had belonged to the ghosts, the eternal echo. In the years following the duel, the story gradually transformed into legend, then myth, and finally into something people told when they wanted to illustrate the inexplicable mystery of the Japanese soul. Official accounts of the incident were suppressed by authorities who considered the narrative inconvenient for the national project of modernization. Western journalists discovered that their editors rejected stories that contradicted established beliefs about technological superiority. But among certain circles, war veterans who understood that courage could transcend equipment, artists who recognized that beauty sometimes required sacrifice, philosophers who suspected that progress didn't always mean improvement, the story persisted and grew. Tanaka Keisuke dedicated the rest of his life to preserving not only the techniques his master had demonstrated, but also the philosophy that had made such demonstration possible. His small school in Kyoto became a place of pilgrimage for those who felt that something essential had been lost in the nation's rush to embrace Western modernity. "My master did not fight to prove that swords are superior to pistols," Keisuke explained to students who had been seeking to understand the inexplicable. "He fought to demonstrate that the human spirit can transcend limitations that others consider absolute." The katana was merely a vehicle for this demonstration. It could have been a calligraphy brush, or a perfectly poured tea, or a poem composed at the moment of death. Decades later, as Japan engaged in wars that ravaged continents, Japanese soldiers carried the spirits of their samurai ancestors within their souls, even as they wielded rifles and dropped bombs. The Bushidō that Watanabe had temporarily resurrected became a force that would shape the destiny of nations, sometimes to glory, sometimes to tragedy, always with an intensity that made other peoples recoil in awed admiration. Historians have tried to explain why the Japanese fought with a ferocity that defied military logic, why they preferred death to surrender, why they transformed tactical defeat into spiritual victory through sacrifice that others considered senseless suicide. The answer lay buried in Sakamoto's garden, where a ghost had proved that certain truths are more powerful than bullets. The last katana duel ended in 1912, but its echoes continued to reverberate throughout Japanese history like a bell that never stops ringing. And in moments when the nation faced crises that tested its soul, some remembered the story of an old samurai who chose to die a free man rather than live as a museum relic. Because in the end, Watanabe Nobuyoshi had won more than a duel. He had conquered death itself, transforming his final act into a legend that would outlive all the empires that tried to bury it. Modern Japan built cities of steel and glass, where castles of wood and paper once stood. But buried within the foundations of these cities, like a secret treasure, remained the spirit of men who believed that honor was worth more than life, that beauty justified suffering, that some principles were worthy of death. And sometimes, on nights when the wind blew through gardens where tradition and modernity still fought for supremacy, people swore they could hear the whisper of a katana being unsheathed, not in anger, but in a promise that some things never truly die, only wait for the right moment to awaken again. The last samurai had become the first ghost of an age that had not yet learned to let its dead rest in peace.